Carol Burnett arrived in New York City in August of 1954 and checked into the Algonquin Hotel by herself. Dawn wouldn't be arriving for a couple of months. And right before Carol left for New York, she had a couple of wisdom teeth extracted, costing $300. Her flight to New York was $158, and the Algonquin was $9 a night. Carol had very little money left from the $1,000 and had only been in New York for 5 days. She was really missing Nanny and Chrissy and Dawn, and she was even missing her shower rod closet. Carol started second-guessing her decision to move when she called a friend from UCLA who knew a friend who was able to get her into the rehearsal club. The rehearsal club was a very well-known building funded by rich older socialites. It housed young, aspiring actresses. In fact, to even live at the rehearsal club, you had to prove you were actively auditioning. The movie Stage Door, starring Katharine Hepburn and Lucille Ball, was based on the rehearsal club. Well, Carol got a job as a hat check girl at Susan Palmer's, a ladies' tea room, and the money she would earn there would allow Carol to afford the $18 a week room and board at the rehearsal club. Barely. December had rolled around, and Carol was not yet the star Nanny had hoped she would be. In fact, Carol couldn't even afford a plane ticket home. Christmas was approaching, and the only thing Carol had to keep her company were the countless letters Nanny had sent. And it was supposed to be the most magical time in New York, but nothing felt magical, especially considering that shortly before, Carol had received some devastating news.
I heard the telephone ring even before it woke me up. It was late. I picked it up after the third ring. I knew it was for me. It was Mama, with the news that Daddy was dead. Daddy. It hadn't even occurred to me. I felt stupid. And here I was in New York, and there he was, dead. And I didn't have any money to get to him. Too late. He never saw me in a school show, but I was going to bring him to New York someday. Ticket for opening night, I'd promised him. And he'd promised me. It was just beginning to get light when I finally cried. I remember reaching back and getting my pillow and pushing it up hard against my face so I wouldn't wake any of the girls up. And I screamed into it as loud as I dared, God damn it. Why? Why'd you have to go and do that to yourself? What's the matter with you anyway? Don't you care? Don't you know how much it hurts? How much I hurt? You told me you were doing okay. Oh, why? Why couldn't you have been okay, Daddy? For me.
One day, Carol was flipping through the newspaper when she spotted an ad for her idol, George Abbott's latest Broadway musical, The Pajama Game. Starring in it was an actor named Eddie Foy Jr., who Carol had a connection to. You see, out here on Yucca, Carol was neighbors with an actor who booked a small gig, as a police officer in an Eddie Foy Jr. movie. Well, he told Carol that Eddie was one swell guy. That was Carol's connection. So, like a scene out of All About Eve, she actually went to the St. James Theater and waited for Eddie Foy Jr. to come out of the stage door. And when he did, she introduced herself to him, told him all about their connection back in Hollywood, and he looked at her like, who the hell are you? But Carol just kept going on and on, even told Eddie all about her plans to star on Broadway. Well, she must have charmed him, because he actually gave her his agent's contact info and said, call my agent, maybe he can help you. That's exactly what she did. She marched into his office carrying her UCLA scrapbook full of her accolades, and he gave her the tired old song and dance. Look, I can't represent you unless you're in something, and you can't get in something unless you have representation. Frustrated, Carol was like, well, what do you want me to do about it? He said, I don't know, put on your own show. Well, those words stuck in her mind. Put on your own show. She rallied some of the rehearsal club girls, and that is exactly what they did. They wrote a show about writing their own show. Don would produce and direct it. They raised $100 so that they could afford one night at the Carl Fisher Concert Hall. It was sort of like a Broadway review. Each girl would get to showcase their talents. Well, they got actress Katharine Cornell to sign the invitations and sent them out to every agent, manager, director, writer, producer. If they were in show business, they got an invitation. Well, on opening night, the girls peeked out behind the curtain and couldn't believe their eyes. They saw Marlene Dietrich in the audience, and speaking of All About Eve, Celeste Holm. Well, Carol performed a song called Monotonous. It was made famous by Eartha Kitt, who of course seduced the audience with her sexy, sultry performance and her skin-tight black leather pants. Carol's version had her in a house dress wearing curlers and slippers. She performed in a over-exaggerated, frumpy, dowdy way, and the audience lost their minds. They were howling. She hit it out of the park. Not just Carol, all of the girls did. And backstage, everyone was buzzing. Marlene Dietrich was congratulating everyone, and Celeste Holm took Carol aside and said, "If there's anything I can ever do for you, don't hesitate to reach out." More importantly than that, though, Carol was bombarded by business cards from agents and managers and finally got representation. Carol finally felt like she belonged in New York City. Now a legitimate actress with representation, Carol booked a few walk-on roles on the Colgate Hour with Martha Raye, and also booked a gig as the comedy act at the Green Mansions Resort in upstate New York, very Mrs. Maisel. And when the gig was over, Carol splurged on a plane ticket back here to LA. It had been 8 months since she had seen her family, and it wasn't the homecoming she thought it would be. Chrissy was really the only thing that had grown. Everything else felt like death. Mama was even more of a mess. I mean, she'd pass out drunk, and the only way anyone knew if she was even alive would be if Chrissy's parakeet, that was usually perched on Mama's chest, was rising up and down with her breathing. And when she wasn't asleep, she and Nanny were arguing and fighting as usual. I mean, it just felt like death out here, and New York City felt like life. Carol couldn't wait to return, and as soon as she did, she booked a gig on NBC's Paul Winchell Kitty TV show, which aired on Saturday mornings. And there's a great reason Paul has a star on the Walk of Fame. He's so fascinating, too. When he was a small kid recovering from polio, he learned ventriloquism. He created and made his own dummy and eventually took the show on the road. It was so successful that he got his own TV show and named it after himself and his creation, the dummy, who he had named Jerry Mahoney. He then went on to work very heavily as a voice actor. Oh, you've heard him on several Hanna-Barbera shows, including Dick Dastardly of Dastardly and Muttley, and as Gargamel on The Smurfs, but his most successful role was voicing Disney's Tigger. He continued to work on and off camera throughout the 60s, including game shows like What's My Line, and he appeared on The Brady Bunch, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and The Lucy Show. But this is where it just gets wild. In the 70s, he did pre-med at Columbia and then graduated from the Acupuncture Research College of Los Angeles and became an acupuncturist. But then he starts inventing things, achieving more than 30 patents, including one for the artificial heart. I mean, just a wild life. But anyway, this was huge. Carol was going to be on national television. She and Nanny had continued their letter writing back and forth, but this deserved a phone call. And Nanny was over the moon when Carol told her that she was going to be singing Over the Rainbow to Jerry Mahoney. Of course, Nanny wanted to know how much Carol would be making. Not a lot, but she was getting exposure, and that was what was important. Well, then say hello to me, Nanny barked. Carol explained to her that it wasn't that easy, that there were scripts and rules to follow. "Oh, come on, just tell him I'm your grandmother who raised you, and that I'm all the way across the country and you just want to say hi to me. That won't hurt NBC. Nanny, I can't. I just can't say hi to you. I'm sorry." But then Carol remembered a dancer friend of hers had sent a signal to her little boy when she performed, so Carol thought she could do the same for Nanny. "All right, Nanny, look, when I walk out onto the stage, I'm going to tug my ear. I'm going to pull my ear. It's going to be a special signal to you, reminding you that I love you." Well, on December 17th, 1955, Carol Burnett took to the Paul Winchell television stage and for the first time tugged her ear for Nanny. Nanny loved it. Absolutely loved it. But what she didn't love was that later that afternoon, Carol and Don were getting married. It's not that Nanny and Mama didn't like Don. They did. They got to really know him while Carol was at UCLA, but they wanted her to marry rich, and he wasn't. In fact, he was in the same boat as Carol, booking minimal gigs here and there. The excitement from the rehearsal club show had died down. Nobody was knocking down their doors anymore. Carol got paid for her 13-week run on the Paul Winchell gig, but then it was Unemploymentville. She and Don finally moved into an apartment together above La Scala, an Italian restaurant at West 54th between 6th and 7th, and their rent was an arm and a leg, a whopping $110 a month, but they made it work. Soon afterwards, Carol auditioned with Buddy Hackett to play a small role in his new sitcom called Stanley. She got the job almost on the spot and had 13 more weeks of employment. The summer of 1956 had Carol headlining as the lead comedian at the Tamiment Resort in the Poconos. Just like at Green Mansions, it was an all-inclusive resort where Danny Kaye and Imogene Coca got their starts. Carol would be joining her friend Ken Welch and his wife on this trip. Ken was a writer. He and Carol had met in the hallway of an audition and realized they could work extremely well together. They'd be putting on an original musical comedy review once a week at the Tamiment, and when the gig was up, Carol and Ken auditioned for a CBS talent search and were sent right up the ladder to Garry Moore. Garry was an extremely popular star who had his own daily morning show. He loved to introduce his audience to new talents and told Carol and Ken that anytime they had new material, they could come on Garry's show and not even have to audition. Well, things were really shaping up for Carol in 1957. On January 6, Elvis Presley appeared for the third time on The Ed Sullivan Show. It's a very well-known episode because CBS censored it. They only showed Elvis from the waist up. Ed Sullivan had received too many complaints from Elvis's two prior bookings, so this time CBS did things differently. However, the studio audience could still see everything that was happening below the waist and were going just wild for Elvis. But also on that show, Ed Sullivan introduced newcomer Carol Burnett. The producers had seen her on the Garry Moore Show and invited her on for a short segment. And later that summer, Carol sort of had a moment that in today's world would be considered a viral moment. Carol's manager booked her along with Ken at the Blue Angel Cabaret. She was doing 2 shows a night for 7 nights for a few weeks. Now, it was during this huge Elvis craze, right? So Ken came up with a brilliant idea. He wrote a song, and instead of it being about a girl who goes crazy for Elvis Presley, it would be about a girl who goes crazy for the most boring, mundane guy they could think of, and that guy was named John Foster Dulles, his last name apropos. If you've ever flown into Washington, D.C., you know the airport that's named for him. He was also the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower and was the last person anyone wanted to get hot and heavy with, which, of course, made the song an instant smash. Carol sang it about him with the intensity of a teenage girl going crazy for Elvis. The Blue Angel hadn't seen lines that long in ages. It was so popular that Carol was booked on The Tonight Show starring Jack Parr. It was huge. Newspapers were talking about it, front pages.
The first time I saw him was at the UN. Oh, I never had been one to swoon over men, but I swooned and the drum started pounding, and then I made a fool of myself over John Foster Dulles.
Carol's name was all over the place. The State Department even called Jack Parr and said that Mr. Dulles had missed the performance and wondered if Jack would have Carol back on a couple nights later. He did. Then Ed Sullivan called and she did it on his show. Carol Burnett was the talk of New York. Things back in Hollywood, however, weren't going so great.
Chrissy knew I was coming out for a few days before the holidays. Nanny had told her. I didn't know why, but I felt it was very important for me to go. I arrived in the early afternoon the first week in December, 1957. Nanny cried when she saw me. I hugged and kissed her a lot and went down the hall to see Mama. The shades were down and she was asleep. I decided to head straight for LeConte, where Chrissy was a 7th grader. I figured it would be fun to surprise her on the way home from school. We spotted each other at the same time. "Sissy," she screamed, "you're here!" I think I was more surprised at what I saw than she was. She had shaved off her eyebrows. Her perfectly arched, thick black eyebrows looked like 5 o'clock shadow. She had replaced them with black pencil. She was wearing apple red lipstick and a matching red sweater that emphasized her 34C chest. She was sauntering up Bronson Avenue from LeConte with about 3 or 4 guys horsing around on the street outside the bowling alley. She was 12. I wanted to cry. I had to do something. It had been a couple of years or close to it since I'd been home for a visit, and it had been bad enough the last time, but now it was even worse. Everything had changed, gotten older, more worn out. The building, Nanny, Mama, especially Mama. She looked awful. She was bloated all over. Her puffy cheeks were covered in broken blood vessels, and the once beautiful big blue eyes looked milky. Her long eyelashes had all but vanished, and her hair was thinning and stringy. Even though she couldn't eat much of anything, her stomach looked as if she'd swallowed a basketball. She lived in one old nightgown and never left her apartment. I've been lying awake on the old couch for 2 nights in a row when I finally made up my mind that I would have to have a talk with Mama, alone. I didn't want Nanny in on this because I knew she'd queer the deal. There was no way in the world they could handle Christine. Mama was too sick, and Nanny was too old and nervous. So it was up to me. But the deal had to be struck with Mama. I had to let her in on it, make her a part of it. I couldn't leave her out. She was so sick. It would be too mean. So my plan had to have her blessing. Christine was at school and Nanny was at the store. It was mid-morning and a good time to get through to Mama. Her hangover would be somewhat in check, and even though she'd be on her way to getting drunk all over again, she wouldn't be there yet. I went into her apartment and locked the door. The shades were down and the old faded flowered curtains blocked out any cracks the bright Hollywood sunshine might be able to peep through. She was on top of the covers, bathed in sweat. God, the room stank. I pulled up the window a good 6 inches. It helped a little, not enough, but a little. Mama got up out of bed and threw on her old robe. We sat on the couch. She fussed a bit with her hair. I remembered how beautiful she'd once been. She lit a cigarette. "Yeah, you were pretty good on that last Sullivan show you did. Must have been a kick meeting Elvis. God, I'm nuts about him. Hey, if you ever meet Marlon Brando, give him my number, will you?" We talked about New York, and she brightened up a little. "Yeah, I always wanted to go there. New York. New York's my kind of town. I'd have made it there. It's where all the smart ones are. Did I tell you your father appeared to me in a vision the middle of the night he died?" She had, but I said, "Tell me about it." "Was the damnedest thing. I was right there in that bed, and out of the blue, I could hear Jody calling to me. 'Lou, Lou.' And the next thing I knew, I could actually see him. He was lying on a cot somewhere, and he was trying to get through to me." Mama inhaled the smoke. "Well, I got right up out of that bed and I started phoning all over town to track him down. I knew he was trying to reach me. I knew it. My intuition never fails me. You know that. And this was a goddamn vision. Something was definitely wrong. And I got a hold of a few of his old cronies, and I finally found out he was in some dump in Venice Beach. Well, I woke up Christine, and we got dressed, and we took the streetcar and the bus clear out there. It was damn near dawn when we found him, but we found him. He still had TB, plus pneumonia. Christ. She ground out her cigarette in the old Stork Club ashtray she'd had for years. She sighed, and she went on. There he was, lying there in this filthy shack, surrounded by a bunch of passed-out winos. I heard he'd gone off the wagon and was on the streets in Venice. Her voice broke. He was dying, Carol. She got up and poured herself a shot. She was shaking, and she turned and pointed her finger at me. I always loved Jody. I want you to know that, baby. He was weak as hell, but there never was one sweeter. Never. Oh, God, he was so thin. He was so awfully thin. I mean, he was never fat, but he looked like a goddamn skeleton lying there on that bed. And I stood at the foot of the bed, and he stared at me for a minute, and I said, Jody, do you know who this is? And he said, you were once my wife. Well, that did it, Carol. I started crying, and I couldn't stop. We were both crying now, and she wiped her eyes with her fingers. Oh, Christ, life. Mama, I said, let me have Christine. Let me take her to New York. She looked at me. For how long? For keeps? She looked scared. Well, how about just for Christmas? She'd get a big kick out of that. Mama, please, she's growing wild out here. Let me have her. You know I'll take good care of her. I love her, too. We didn't say anything for a while, and then Mama looked at me. For keeps, huh? I nodded. After a very long time, she finally spoke. Okay, I won't say anything. We'll tell Christine and the old lady it's just for the holidays. We were thinking exactly alike. We knew Christine wouldn't leave with me if she thought she wouldn't be coming back, and we knew if Nanny got wind of it, she'd tell her. I'd secretly check Chrissy out of LeConte at the end of the week, and Mama would tell Nanny once we were gone, and I'd tell Chrissy after I got her to New York. It would all be okay. It was for the best. In the meantime, mum's the word. I hugged Mama, and she smiled and cocked her head. She looked almost pretty. Take care of the baby for me, will you, kiddo? You know I will, Mama. It was the best talk we'd ever had, and it was the closest I'd ever felt to her in my whole life. 1 month later, she was dead. We got the call from Nanny on January 10th. Oh, God, Mama. I knew it was coming, down deep. I knew it. That's why I took Chris, and Mama knew it. That's why she let me take Chris. And Chris, I think she knew it too. Chrissy and I couldn't be there. We didn't have the money. We were 3,000 miles away when Mama was cremated. And I remembered her saying, no hole in the ground for this kid. I'll come back and get you if you ever let him throw dirt in my face. It had been such a beautiful face.
Carol returned to New York City with Chrissy, who was not thrilled when she learned she wouldn't be coming back here. In fact, she threw quite a fit. She caused quite a scene. She accused Carol of kidnapping her, but she eventually calmed down and realized it was the best decision for her, and she must have really been craving some sort of discipline and structure deep down, because she even became excited to attend an all-girls boarding school just outside the city in New Jersey that was run by Episcopal nuns. She would live at the school during the week, but would come home and stay with Don and Carol on the weekends and holidays. Carol and Chrissy were only back in New York a few months before Carol returned here to Yucca. Nanny just couldn't handle living in 102 anymore. The memories, they were just too painful. Mama was dead, and now her 2 granddaughters were living on the East Coast. So Carol helped Nanny get a 2-bedroom apartment just a few blocks away on Cherokee Avenue. And Carol spent a couple days helping Nanny move out. She had 18 years worth of belongings that Carol hand-walked over to Cherokee, making, millions of trips. She couldn't rent a car or hire help. She barely had any money. Her manager helped her get a loan so she could pay for Chrissy's boarding school. And in fact, Carol was actually out here because she booked a gig on the Dinah Shore show and decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone by moving Nanny. And a move it was. I mean, some things Carol had remembered unpacking the day she and Nanny had moved in. Well, it was awful. It was treacherous, but Carol eventually made this walk for the last time once the very last box of junk was dropped off just down there on Cherokee. And after Carol had gotten everything out of 102, she walked down the hall to Mama's old apartment. There was a light coming out from under the door and the sounds of a new tenant. Life goes on. Carol thought about how she missed Mama and how different everything was, how different she was. She was almost 25 years old now, and instead of Nanny taking care of her, she was taking care of Nanny. And on top of that, she was newly married and already raising a teenager. Seemed like just yesterday Carol had been complaining that she wasn't growing up fast enough, and now it was just all going too fast. Conveniently enough, though, while Carol was in town doing the Dinah Shore show, she was put up right here at the Hollywood Hawaiian Motel, now the Princess Grace Apartments, which sit on top of what used to be, the vacant lot where Carol and the neighborhood gang had played all those years before. The setting for all those moments when Carol and gang would play movie stars and war games, and where they would just run around being kids. Staying in the old apartment wasn't even an option anymore. Now, Carol would be sleeping on top of the old lot in a motel. I talk a lot more about this motel in my Whitley Heights story location tour. It really has an interesting history. 2 years before Carol checked in here to move Nanny, Woody Allen married his first wife in the lobby. And a member of Fleetwood Mac was staying here when he disappeared. Warren Zevon wrote a song about the motel. Really wild history. And speaking of songs, the lobby that's featured inside the Eagles' Hotel California album is actually the lobby of the Lido right there, the building right across from Carol's. Such a pop culture riddled area, yet I bet most people who live around here don't even know it. And before any of it happened, it was just Carol Burnett's neighborhood. And now for Carol, it was an area of the past. For now, anyway. Carol Burnett returned to New York, now a fully grown woman, one without either parent. Now, she was essentially the parent, having to make sure that 3 mouths were getting fed. They were all barely getting by on the money from her television appearances and from Don's even less frequent work, when in February of 1959, Carol got a call from our old pal Garry Moore, who now had a primetime weekly variety show on CBS, which aired Tuesday nights at 10. It was a huge hit, but that week's guest star, Martha Ray, was sick. Could Carol possibly fill in? What? Yes, of course she could fill in. But she was freaking out. Martha had been rehearsing all week, and Carol only had a couple of days to learn the entire show. Well, she not only pulled it off, she hit it out of the park. The audience fell in love with her, and Garry couldn't have been more grateful. And after the show, a security guard stopped Carol as she was leaving CBS. He was holding a phone. It was Martha Ray calling to congratulate Carol, but she said she'd never get sick and miss a show again because Carol was too good. Well, a couple days later, Carol got a call to audition for Rodgers and Hart's Babes in Arms on Broadway. Finally, the whole reason she moved to New York. Well, she auditioned and was called back several times in a grueling process, singing for producers over and over and over. Back at UCLA, she had seen herself on the Broadway stage. Granted, she saw herself being directed by George Abbott, but this was why she was even there. She had to have this part. Well, they called her in one last time, and when Carol opened her mouth to sing, it wasn't there. She just couldn't do it. She knew she lost the part and was devastated. When she got home, Chrissy was there, home on spring break, and she comforted Carol. Remember what we always say, sissy, when one door closes, another one opens. Knock it off, Carol thought. Well, a couple days later, the phone rang. This time, it was for an audition the following morning for a brand new musical that would start rehearsals in 2 weeks and open at the Phoenix Theater in May. It was called Once Upon a Mattress, based on The Princess and the Pea by Hans Christian Andersen, our Selma Avenue Elementary School favorite. Oh, and it was being directed by legendary Broadway director George Abbott. Carol, of course, reminded Chrissy, when one door closes, another one opens. Carol got the part. Broadway at last, just as she had visualized it back at UCLA. Once Upon a Mattress opened in May of 1959 as part of the off-Broadway Phoenix Theater's summer season, but after 6 weeks, moved up to Broadway, where it lasted for over a year. Mama may have called it a pipe dream, but this little girl was now grown up and living her ultimate fantasy. Carol Burnett was officially a Broadway star. Oh, and on Monday, June 22nd, 1959, Carol and Don paid back their $2,000 loan to Mr. C. 5 years to the day. He never wrote them back.
Everyone fall in step for the brightest, gayest musical comedy of the season, Once Upon a Mattress, with Carol Burnett recreating the Broadway role that made her a star overnight.
I confess that I'm shy. Can't you guess that this confident air is a mask that I wear 'cause I'm shy? By the way, I don't think I ever told you before. My full name is Winifred the Woebegone. But Winifred's too formal. You can call me by my nickname.
Winnie?
Fred.
I'm in love with a girl named Fred. She wrestles like a Greek.
Yes, enjoy Carol Burnett at her rollicking best in Once Upon a Mattress.
While Carol was performing on Broadway, Garry Moore had called her again, this time with an offer to come on the variety show and join the cast as a full-time player. She, of course, accepted, and for 1 year did both jobs side by side. If her energy wasn't aimed at Mattress, it was aimed at Garry's show, and vice versa, which left no time for her marriage. She and Don both knew it. They barely saw each other anymore, and on top of that, Carol was a star now. She was getting recognized on the streets and at restaurants, and Don, poor Don, was barely even getting by, sometimes even driving a taxi. It was really rough on him, but it was really rough on her, too. She felt so guilty. This was the life she always wanted. She had love for Don, but it had just marinated in the words of Nanny and Mama, you know, pushing her to find a man and tie the knot. Marriage was their dream, not Carol's. So Don and Carol divorced, but the best part was they divorced on the most amicable of terms as really good friends, the way it started back at UCLA. And oh, I love this. About 20 years after their divorce, a woman stopped Carol in an elevator and said, You don't know me, but we have something in common. I married Don Soroyan, and we have 3 children. Carol smiled and said to the lady, "Congratulations, you are married to a wonderful man." Well, now Carol was a newly divorced woman at 27, taking care of her 16-year-old sister, but the world was ushering in a new decade, and things were really going great. She had won Theater World Magazine's annual award for Most Promising Newcomer. She shared it with a few people you may have heard of: Warren Beatty, Patty Duke, Eileen Brennan, and Jane Fonda, all of whom made their Broadway debuts in 1959. The early 60s were great to Carol. She stayed on the Garry Moore Show until 1962, and she didn't leave empty-handed. Heading out into the next chapter of her life with her would be her very first Emmy Award, and she won it for Best Performance in a Variety Show for 1962. Carol has really continued all of her life to just praise Garry Moore and her time on his show. I could talk about it for another hour. I mean, one of the writers who wrote Carol's sketches was Neil Simon. I mean, get out of here. The education, the experience she got on that show, I'm condensing it since we're not in New York, but there are just really a lot of great stories from that extremely underrated and very underappreciated gem of a variety show. Oh, and to this nerd, the best part, the absolute best part, the part that just fills me with joy is that Nanny got to see all of this. She got to go to a taping.
It would be her first time east of Texas, and she would be reunited with her grandbabies. I met Nanny as she got off the plane. She was all smiles and waves. The flight had been a good one. It hadn't fallen down. And at 77, she was none the worse for wear. Chris was thrilled to see Nanny, and Nanny was amazed by how much Chris had grown. She was tall, filled out, and a beautiful teenager. We settled Nanny down in Chris's room, and that night we all had a celebratory cup of Ovaltine before we turned in. Since I was no longer doubling in Once Upon a Mattress, I had some free time to show Nanny around the Big Apple between rehearsals for Garry's show. She loved Sardi's restaurant because there were always a lot of celebrities there to gawk at. And if I knew them, I had to introduce them to my grandmother, or I never would have heard the end of it. Nanny was in the audience for Garry's show the following Friday, absolutely beaming. Garry came out to do the warm-up for the audience. "Welcome to our show, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a great one for you tonight, but before we get underway, there's someone I want you to meet who's in our audience." Backstage, I was peeking through the curtain, and it dawned on me he was going to introduce Nanny. Bless Garry, there was no one nicer. He walked to the edge of the stage and continued, "There's a special little lady here tonight visiting New York for the first time. She raised our own Carol Burnett, Carol's grandmother. Where are you, dear?" Nanny bounced up out of her seat like a pogo stick and yelled, "Over here, Garry!" The audience politely applauded, and then Nanny threw both arms up into the air, clasped her hands together, and waved them back and forth like a heavyweight champion. The audience howled, and all I could do was shake my head and smile.
Carol, it hasn't been very long since you were one of the legion of unknown actresses. Have you become accustomed yet to being recognized on the street?
Oh, yes. It's terribly flattering. I really love it. What happens, though, is I find myself getting left-handed compliments because I don't photograph too well. Not that they've got a lot to work with, but it doesn't help being on television looking the way I do. Am I making myself clear? Anyway.
I think you're being too modest.
Thank you. No, what happens is someone a man the other day recognized me on the street, and he grabbed me and he said, "Dub, dub, dub," and he called his wife. He says, "Hey, Meg, look, she ain't such a dog." And that was one of the, I thought it was sweet, though. He meant well.
Carol, why did you decide to leave the land of motion pictures to come to New York?
Well, I'll tell you, out in Hollywood, I was at UCLA, and I left right from school, and in Hollywood, if you don't look like Marilyn Monroe or Tony Curtis, you're not going to really get a star. I don't look like either one of them.
You look more like Marilyn Monroe.
More like Tony Curtis, luckily. So I came to New York because that's the best way to get started, and I wanted to be another Ethel Merman, Mary Martin, Judy Holliday, and headed right for the stage. I never dreamed I would be doing more television, which I do love. Garry's show is the most fun in the whole world.
Following her departure from the Garry Moore Show, Carol did a handful of TV guest spots, including an episode of The Twilight Zone that was meant to become a spin-off. The show was going to be about an angel who has to change lives for the better, and Carol's character would be his first challenge. The spin-off never happened, but Rod Serling was such a big fan of Carol's that he wrote her a part as an usherette working at a grand Hollywood movie theater. Sound familiar?
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
Carol seemed to have these bouts with stardom where her career would be real hot for a minute, then things would cool down, then hot again, then cool. The same thing was happening to another musical theater actress across town. Julie Andrews had made an incredible splash on Broadway in 1956's My Fair Lady, regarded as one of the greatest theatrical performances and shows, but it really didn't do anything for Julie's stardom, if you will. There was no national exposure. And when the film version came out, Hollywood went with Audrey Hepburn as the Fair Lady. Julie just was not a household name, and Carol was always the second banana to Buddy Hackett, to Garry Moore. Really, both of these women were sort of in a career limbo. Now, Carol is 2 years older than Julie. They both grew up very poor, both had divorced parents, and both had careers in musical theater. Carol actually saw My Fair Lady 4 times, and Julie saw Mattress, and Julie's manager came backstage and asked Carol if she would like to get dinner with Julie. Carol jumped at the chance, but was a little nervous because she expected this refined English woman. That wasn't Julie. Julie Andrews apparently has a really vivid sense of humor, can throw out the curse words, and loves practical jokes. The two women hit it off instantly, and they knew they had to work together. Julie, she did an episode of the Garry Moore Show, but they wanted something bigger. And so did one of the Garry Moore Show producers, one of the youngest producers working in television at the time, named Joe Hamilton. Joe, along with another producer, Bob Banner, thought that a TV special would be the perfect vehicle for Julie and Carol to shine their talents off one another, and decided that it should be at Carnegie Hall. Well, CBS didn't go for it. They said nobody west of the Mississippi even knows who Julie Andrews is, and Carol just isn't a big enough star. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, those hadn't come out yet. Well, the legend goes that Carol was at a CBS luncheon at the Waldorf Hotel. She was seated amongst the executives when she blurted out, "It's a real shame you passed on that special." They were taken back and looked up at her as she continued, "Well, Julie and I do look better in color anyway." At the time, CBS's rival, NBC, was the only network in color, so the men sat up and they all chimed in. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "Yeah," Carol said. "Yeah, we're going to do a special at Carnegie Hall. Going to be pretty big. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your lunch," and out she went. A few minutes later, Carol was trying to flag down a taxi, but she couldn't find one, and the executives were now exiting the hotel. They offered to wait with her until she found a taxi, but Carol waved them away, saying, "Nonsense, I always find my ride." And just then, a huge delivery truck rolled by, and Carol flagged it down. The driver stopped, and Carol yelled, "Can I get a ride to Central Park West?" "Hop in, honey," he said, and before she climbed into the truck's cab, she turned to the executives, waved, and said, "See you at Carnegie Hall." Well, that night, one of those executives called Carol and said, "Congratulations, you just sold yourself a special. Anyone who can pull off a stunt like that deserves to have your very own show."
And a 1, and a 2, and a 3, and a 4, and da-dum-da-dum-da-dum.
Julian Carroll at Carnegie Hall was taped before a live audience at Carnegie Hall on March 5th, 1962, and it aired on June 11th on CBS. It was directed by Joe Hamilton and written by our good old pal Ken Welch and a young up-and-coming genius named Mike Nichols. A soundtrack album was released as well, but how crazy is this? 60 years after that concert, 60! There just so happens to be a little tribute to these two sublime legends. What a treat to see this while I just happened to be out filming. I'm not kidding when I tell you I randomly stumbled upon it when I started filming this tour. There's a series of this celebrity art all around the boulevard, but this is just wild timing. Anyway, the special was so successful that CBS set up a 2-month tour around the country for Julie and Carol. However, Julie got pregnant and was unable to commit. Carol didn't want to do it without Julie for several reasons. First of all, they were such great friends and enjoyed each other's company, but Carol didn't really see herself as a singer. Not a singer like Julie or even Liza or Barbara. Carol knew she could belt it out and carry all the right notes, but she really liked performing either in some sort of self-deprecating character or in a duet or in a comedy sketch, not on stage by herself. Which, okay, there are two things I completely disagree with Carol Burnett on. Her looks, I think she's so beautiful, and her singing. I think it's just terrific.
So it's the meantime. All they gave me is that in between time for my loving and my living. Gotta do it in the time. Before I was born, a lot of love happened, a lot of love happened, I'm well aware. Yeah, after I'm gone, a lot of love will happen that I'll be doing without. So it's the meantime.
Well, Carol was convinced to bite the bullet, and she set off on a 2-month tour around the country. Chrissy was home from boarding school, and she decided to join her big sis. When the tour wrapped up in Las Vegas that summer, Carol was met with some executives from CBS. She had received offers from just about every network, but CBS's was unprecedented. They would sign her for 10 years. She would earn $100,000 a year and would have up to 5 years to decide whether or not she wanted her own series or a variety show. If she didn't find anything suitable after 5 years, CBS would choose the vehicle for her. In those 5 years, she would be contracted to a couple of specials and 2 guest appearances a year on CBS shows. On top of all that, Carol would have creative control over whatever she chose. She signed the contract on August 29th, 1962. And 9 months later, she won her second Emmy, this time for Julian Carroll at Carnegie Hall. In 1962, Carol returned to LA to make her film debut alongside Dean Martin and Elizabeth Montgomery in Who's Been Sleeping in My Bed? It would be filmed at Paramount Pictures in Hollywood as well as here at the Beverly Hills Hotel. It was Carol's first time working on a film set, and it also gave her a chance for a quick visit with Nanny. The movie was considered a really big flop, and Carol has spent several decades making jokes about it and apologizing to anyone who's ever seen it. It's not that bad at all, though. It's one of those super silly, campy, over-the-top 60s comedies. It's actually a kick to watch, especially for the cast. Carol, she's hilarious. I mean, the typical sidekick friend to the lead role, but she adds so much to it. Dean and Elizabeth, always exciting to watch, and Jill St. John and Martin Balsam are also in it. It's fun. It's really fun. Plus, it's filmed here at the hotel, which I think everyone knows by now is the hotel on the cover of the Eagles Hotel California album, which, kids, if you've been paying attention, we know that the inside of that album features the lobby of the Lido apartment building next to Carol's childhood apartment on Yucca. There's a fun pool scene in the movie that was shot here at the pool. Also, the site of probably the greatest photo ever taken. Faye Dunaway the morning after she won her Oscar. But Carol was really taken back by the difference in how movies and TV shows were made. Television, especially when it was live, was just go, go, go. Movies were hours and hours and hours and hours of waiting and sitting around before sitting around and waiting some more before waiting around to getting around to filming. Just a night and day difference when it came to TV versus film back then. Stage was her first love, and she was just learning to love television. Film, not her favorite, which is ironic considering just how much she absolutely loved watching movies. I mean, they were her entire world growing up, but making them, completely a different story. She much preferred the faster-paced work experience, I say as I stare longingly at one of those empty lounge chairs down there.
Let's just call it a tryout, shall we?
Hey, Sam. Sam, we hired you for the wedding, not the honeymoon.
I've always had a yen for you, teacher.
Oh, really? Well, isn't that nice? Sam, you know I'm terribly parched. Do you know what I'd like? I think I'd like some champagne. But don't let it get warm in your hot little hands. All right? How about that, kid? He's got the body of a Greek god and the mind of Lolita. You know, you really do look lovely.
Sitting around the art class flexing his muscles, he looked so simple and sweet.
Yeah, well, I always say you never really get to know a person until they put their clothes on. Oh, thank you, Sam. That's...
Elizabeth Montgomery wouldn't do Bewitched for another couple years, and this is so off topic, but I don't know when else I'm going to get to tell you this, but Liz, we call her Liz in the biz, long after Bewitched, Liz turned down the role of Crystal Carrington on Dynasty. What? Cannot even picture that. Anyway, I know this area has been vastly improved over the years, but honestly, maybe because I just watched Carol's scene this morning before I came here, but it's so, I don't know, the vibe is, it's so 60s to me right now. The cabanas are still to my left. You can see them in the movie, but there are people in them, so it feels a little invasive to film them, so I'm not going to. But in that last shot, when I was on the balcony, you can see them.
Well, look, I love Melissa, but I ain't gonna get caught in no trap. And I'm not sticking to one girl. My life's gonna be one whole big happy smorgasbord.
Yeah. Well, if you ever need a piece of herring, you know where to find me. Hey, Jason, they're lining up for the wedding picture. Come on, huh, please?
Oh, I'm against wedding pictures, and I'm against weddings.
Come on, Jason, be good.
Deal.
All right.
Join the
A little
picture.
closer.
No sense being a poor loser.
I'll have you know I'm one of the best losers you ever met. You know, people come from miles around just to watch me smile when I lose. So do me a favor, drop dead.
Down by the spa and gift shop area is a photo of Carol taken while she was on set waiting to film her pool scene here, but their caption doesn't even mention it. They're like, Carol Burnett used to chill by our pool back in the day in a house dress. Okay, so I want to tell you this story before we leave. It's one that Carol's just, okay, she's just too classy to tell it, but Joe Hamilton and a few other folks have told it, and I think it should be a bigger fun fact. So, okay, Joe saw this young new actress, Barbara Streisand, in a play, and he booked her on the Garry Moore Show. She was going to sing the original pop version of Happy Days Are Here Again, but Ken Welch, who was now the music director on the show, slowed it down so that Barbara could learn the lyrics, and they discovered that it was much better as a ballad. And we all know it's gone on to be one of her signature songs. Okay, so Ray Stark, I know I'm all over the place, but follow along. Ray Stark was one of the most successful producers in Hollywood during the 60s. West Side Story, The Misfits, Lolita. He'd later go on to do Annie and Steel Magnolias. He also happened to be the son-in-law of Fanny Brice. And he was trying to get her story turned into something. And at that time, there was a script called The Luckiest People. Jerome, or Jerry, Robbins, who won an Oscar for directing West Side Story, was attached at this stage, and he met with Carol. She was really flattered, but didn't think she was right for the part. She said she couldn't pull off the Jewish humor that was needed for the role. She turned it down, but she said to Jerry, "You should look at this girl named Barbara Streisand. We had her on Gary's show. She's currently playing at a nightclub. Take a look at her." Well, he did. And the script went on to be called Funny Girl, and Barbara's career was launched. Now, am I saying that Carol Burnett is responsible for Barbara Streisand's career? Yeah, kinda. But again, Carol is she just doesn't go around taking that kind of credit. She would probably never tell that story. Barbara probably wouldn't either. So, speaking of Joe Hamilton, things started heating up between him and Carol. I'm talking personally. The two kept a very low profile with their relationship outside of work. Not only did they want to appear professional, but both of them were coming off of dissolved marriages, and in the 60s, that wasn't a good look. Not only that, but hold on to your seatbelts with this fact. Joe had 8 children. I'm just exhausted saying it. But it didn't scare or exhaust Carol. In fact, they only grew closer and closer and closer. And on May 4th, 1963, the two of them flew to Mexico and got married. Chrissy flew with them just to be a witness, then headed home so that the couple could honeymoon. Then Joe moved into Carol's apartment on 72nd Street while they figured out their next step, which life sort of did for them. They found out they were expecting a baby, a little girl, Carrie Louise Hamilton, born on December 5th, 1963. The Louise, of course, for Mama. Carol, she spent 1964 balancing motherhood and her Broadway dream. It had been 4 years since Once Upon a Mattress, and she was set to return to the stage, again under the direction of George Abbott, in Fade Out, Fade In. The show opened on May 26 of that year at the Mark Hellinger Theater. But 2 months later, in July, Carol was involved in a really bad car accident while riding in a taxi cab. Her injuries caused her to withdraw from the show, which then closed shortly after. CBS really wanted to have Carol back on their network, and later, in September, Carol and Bob Newhart hosted a one-hour variety show called The Entertainers, produced by Joe. It was a weekly show featuring sketches and musical numbers with guests like, Boris Karloff was on it, Cheetah Rivera, as well as series regulars, Dom DeLuise and Ruth Buzzy. The show only lasted 26 episodes, and it concluded its run in March of 1965. Fade in, fade out. It wasn't a great time in Carol's life at all. Not only was she injured, but the producers were nightmares about it and treated her really terribly. Personally, I think the whole situation diminished her Broadway desires. I really do. But either way, life was now only getting better. The Hamiltons, they felt they needed a big change, and that New York was no longer the place for that to happen. It was going to happen in Beverly Hills.